Welcome to the remarkable story of Washington State, a land shaped by volcanoes and glaciers, nurtured by rivers and rain, and transformed by the dreams and determination of countless peoples across millennia. From the misty shores of the Pacific to the golden wheat fields of the Palouse, from the temperate rainforests of the Olympic Peninsula to the sage-covered hills of the Columbia Basin, Washington's story is one of dramatic landscapes and equally dramatic human history. Our journey begins over 13,000 years ago and extends to the present day, encompassing indigenous civilizations that thrived for millennia. European explorers seeking new worlds, American pioneers pursuing manifest destiny, and modern innovators who've transformed how the world communicates, travels, and does business. This is the story of the Evergreen State, a tale of salmon and software, of timber and technology, of ancient traditions and cutting edge innovation. Part 1. The First Peoples, 13,000 BCE, 1700s CE, Ancient Arrivals and Early Cultures. The human story in Washington begins at the end of the last ice age, when the first peoples arrived in the region approximately 13,000 years ago. Archaeological evidence from sites like the Manus Mastodon site near Sequim reveals that these early inhabitants were hunting massive Ice Age mammals, including mastodons, with sophisticated stone-pointed spears. As the glaciers retreated and the climate warmed, the landscape transformed dramatically. The Puget Sound was carved out by glacial action, creating the complex system of waterways that would define the region. Dense forests emerged, rivers filled with salmon, and the incredible biological diversity that characterizes the Pacific Northwest took shape. By 3000 BCE, distinct cultural groups had emerged throughout the region. In the coastal areas, sophisticated maritime cultures developed, mastering the art of ocean navigation in expertly crafted cedar canoes. These peoples, ancestors of today's Coast Salish, Makah, Quinault, and others, created complex societies based on the abundance of the sea and forest. The salmon civilizations, the Columbia River system, with its legendary salmon runs, became the foundation for numerous inland cultures. The salmon weren't just food, they were central to spirituality, social organization, and trade networks that extended far beyond the region. The annual salmon runs were times of gathering, ceremony, and renewal. Sophisticated fishing technologies, including elaborate weirs and platforms at places like Celilo Falls, allowed for the harvest of millions of pounds of salmon annually. These societies developed without agriculture as it's traditionally understood, instead, practicing sophisticated resource management that some scholars call cultivation without domestication. They manage forest resources through controlled burning, encourage the growth of valuable plants like camas, and maintain clam gardens along the coast. Complex societies and cultural achievements. By 1000 CE, the indigenous peoples of Washington had developed some of North America's most complex non-agricultural societies. The potlatch system, a sophisticated economy based on ceremonial giving, regulated wealth distribution, and maintained social hierarchies. Massive longhouses, some over 100 feet in length, housed extended families, and served as centers for ceremony and governance. The artistic achievements of these cultures were extraordinary. Elaborate totem poles, intricate basketry, sophisticated textiles woven from cedar bark and mountain goat wool, and distinctive artistic styles that continue to influence Northwest art today. The Salish Sea region alone was home to over 50 distinct tribal groups, each with their own dialect, customs, and territories, yet connected through extensive trade and kinship networks. Plateau and Eastern cultures, east of the Cascades, different but equally sophisticated cultures emerged. The Plateau peoples, including ancestors of the Yakama, Spokane, Nez Perce, and Cayuse, developed cultures adapted to the drier interior environment. They were among North America's earliest horse cultures after the animal's reintroduction by the Spanish, quickly mastering mounted hunting and warfare. These groups maintained extensive trade networks, connecting the coast with the Great Plains and even reaching as far as the pueblos of the Southwest. The Dalles on the Columbia River became one of North America's great indigenous trading centers, where goods, ideas, and peoples from across the continent converged. Part 2: The Age of Exploration, 1700s, 1840s. First European contact. The isolation of Washington's indigenous peoples from European diseases and colonization lasted longer than most of North America. The first documented European contact came in 1774 when Spanish explorer Juan Perez sighted the Olympic Mountains and traded with indigenous peoples off the coast. The following year, Bruno de Heceta and Juan Francisco de la Bodega y Cuadra explored more extensively, with Heceta becoming the first European to sight the mouth of the Columbia River. However, it was British Captain James Cook's 1778 expedition that would have the most immediate impact. Though Cook himself only briefly explored Washington waters, his crew's discovery of the incredible value of sea otter pelts in China sparked a fur trade boom that would transform the region. The maritime fur trade era, between 1780 and 1810, the Northwest coast became a hub of international commerce. British, American, Spanish, and Russian traders competed for access to sea otter pelts, which could be purchased for a few iron tools and sold in Canton for enormous profits. This trade brought unprecedented change to indigenous societies, new goods, new diseases, and new political dynamics. The most significant exploration came in 1792 when British Captain George Vancouver and American Captain Robert Gray arrived almost simultaneously. Gray became the first European to enter the Columbia River, naming it after his ship and establishing an American claim to the region. Vancouver, meanwhile, extensively mapped Puget Sound, naming many features that retain those names today: Mount Baker, Mount Rainier, Whidbey Island, and Port Townsend among them. Lewis and Clark, the overland arrival. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 gave the United States a pathway to the Pacific, and President Thomas Jefferson dispatched the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore this new territory and establish American claims to the Oregon country. The expedition reached Washington in October 1805, traveling down the Columbia River and wintering at the river's mouth. Their journey proved that overland travel to the Pacific was possible and provided valuable information about the region's geography, peoples, and resources. Perhaps more importantly, for Washington's future, their presence reinforced American claims to the territory in the growing competition with Britain. The fur trade transforms the interior. As the maritime fur trade depleted sea otter populations, attention turned inland to beaver pelts. The Northwest Company and Hudson's Bay Company, fierce British rivals who would later merge, established trading posts throughout the interior. in 1810, David Thompson of the Northwest Company established Spokane House near present-day Spokane, the first long-term European settlement in Washington. American entrepreneur John Jacob Astor attempted to challenge British dominance by establishing Fort Astoria at the mouth of the Columbia in 1811. But the War of 1812 forced its sale to the British. The Hudson's Bay Company emerged as the dominant force in the region, establishing Fort Vancouver in 1825 as the headquarters for the entire Columbia Department. Fort Vancouver, the New York of the Pacific, under the leadership of Dr. John McLaughlin. Fort Vancouver became the de facto capital of the Oregon Country, located on the north bank of the Columbia River. Present-day Vancouver, Washington, the fort was a multicultural hub where French-Canadian voyageurs, Scottish traders, Hawaiian laborers, indigenous peoples, and eventually American settlers converged. McLaughlin, though representing British interests, maintained relatively peaceful relations with American settlers, even extending credit and supplies to destitute pioneers. This policy would ultimately undermine British claims to the region, as American settlers began arriving in increasing numbers by the 1840s. Part 3. American Settlement and Territorial Period, 1840s, 1889. The Great Migration and Oregon Fever. The 1840s brought Oregon Fever, a massive migration of American settlers to the Oregon Country. Though most headed for the Willamette Valley in present-day Oregon, their arrival shifted the demographic balance decisively toward the United States. The Oregon Trail, stretching over 2,000 miles from Missouri, became the pathway for hundreds of thousands of pioneers. The first major American settlements north of the Columbia came in the 1840s. Tumwater, at the southern tip of Puget Sound, was established in 1845 by Michael Simmons and George Washington Bush. Bush, an African American pioneer, had been prevented from settling in Oregon due to discriminatory laws, ironically making him one of Washington's founding pioneers. The Oregon Treaty and International Boundary. The joint occupation of the Oregon Country by Britain and the United States was increasingly untenable. American expansionists chanted 54, 40, or fight, demanding all territory up to Russian Alaska. However, President James Polk, pragmatic despite campaign rhetoric, negotiated the Oregon Treaty of 1846, establishing the 49th parallel as the boundary, with Vancouver Island remaining British. This decision profoundly shaped Washington's future. The boundary split natural geographic and cultural regions, separating Puget Sound from the Strait of Georgia and dividing indigenous peoples who had lived as unified communities for millennia, creating Washington Territory. As Oregon moved toward statehood in the 1850s, settlers north of the Columbia River grew concerned about being marginalized in a state government centered in the Willamette Valley. A series of conventions, known as the Monticello Convention, petitioned Congress for separate territorial status. On March 2, 1853, President Millard Fillmore signed the legislation creating Washington Territory, carved from the northern portion of Oregon Territory. The new territory was vast, initially including present-day Washington, northern Idaho, and western Montana. Isaac Stevens, an ambitious 35-year-old West Point graduate and Mexican War veteran, was appointed as the first territorial governor. Olympia, a small settlement at the southern tip of Puget Sound, became the territorial capital. The Stevens Treaties, an indigenous dispossession. Governor Stevens arrived with multiple missions: govern the territory, survey a northern railroad route, and negotiate treaties with indigenous peoples. Between 1854 and 1856, Stevens negotiated a series of treaties that would dispossess indigenous peoples of millions of acres while theoretically preserving certain rights. The treaties were deeply controversial and often coercive. Stevens used threats, alcohol, and dubious interpretations to secure agreements. The Medicine Creek Treaty, Point Elliott Treaty, and others confined dozens of tribes to small reservations, while supposedly guaranteeing fishing, hunting, and gathering rights in common with citizens. The treaty wars, resistance to the treaties, was immediate and violent. The Puget Sound War, 1855-1856, saw warriors led by Nisqually Chief Leshy attack settlements and challenge American authority. The conflict spread east of the Cascades, where Yakama Chief Kamiakin led a broader resistance. The wars were brutal, with atrocities committed by both sides. Chief Leshy was ultimately captured, tried in a controversial proceeding, and executed in 1858, an act many contemporaries considered judicially murder. In 2004, a historical court of inquiry exonerated Leshy, acknowledging the injustice of his execution. Early economic development. Despite conflicts, American settlement accelerated. The California gold rush created enormous demand for timber, and Puget Sound's vast forests and excellent harbors made it ideal for the lumber industry. Towns like Port Gamble, Port Madison, and Port Ludlow emerged as major mill towns, attracting workers from around the world. Coal discoveries in the Cascade foothills led to mining operations that would fuel regional development for decades. Agriculture expanded in fertile valleys, with wheat becoming a major crop in the southeastern region. The Fraser Canyon Gold Rush of 1858 in British Columbia brought thousands through Washington Territory, spurring commercial development. The Pig War and San Juan Islands, one of the most unusual conflicts in American history, occurred in 1859 when an American settler shot a British pig on San Juan Island, nearly triggering a war between the United States and Britain. The Pig War highlighted the ambiguity of the water boundary established by the Oregon Treaty. Both nations established military camps on the island, maintaining a tense but peaceful joint occupation for 12 years. In 1872, Kaiser Wilhelm Fritz of Germany, serving as arbitrator, awarded the islands to the United States, finalizing Washington's western boundary. Civil War era and Reconstruction. Though geographically distant from Civil War battlefields, Washington Territory was affected by the conflict. The territory remained loyal to the Union, though Confederate sympathizers were present. The discovery of gold in the Clearwater region led to the creation of Idaho Territory in 1863, reducing Washington to roughly its current boundaries. The post-war period saw increased federal investment in the territory. Military posts were strengthened, surveys were conducted, and infrastructure slowly improved. The completion of the first transcontinental telegraph to Seattle in 1864 connected the territory to instant communication with the rest of the nation. Part 4. The Path to Statehood. 1870s, 1889. The Northern Pacific and railroad politics. The greatest transformation came with the railroads. After years of delays, the Northern Pacific Railway resumed construction in the 1870s. The selection of Tacoma as the western terminus in 1873 shocked Seattle residents who expected their city to be chosen. This decision sparked decades of rivalry between the two cities and fundamentally shaped regional development. The railroad's arrival in 1883 ended Washington's geographic isolation. Journey times from the East Coast dropped from months to days. The population exploded from 75,000 in 1880 to over 350,000 by 1890. Entire new industries emerged to serve national markets, now accessible by rail. The anti-Chinese movement. The economic disruption of the 1880s led to one of Washington's darkest chapters. Chinese immigrants, who had come to build railroads and work in mines, became scapegoats for economic hardship. In 1885-1886, violent anti-Chinese riots erupted in Seattle, Tacoma, and other cities. In Tacoma, the entire Chinese population was forcibly expelled in what became known as the Tacoma Method. Seattle's Chinese community was similarly attacked, though some citizens attempted to protect them. These events led to the Chinese Exclusion Act's strict enforcement and left lasting scars on the region's conscience. Economic boom and bust. The 1880s brought spectacular growth and equally spectacular collapses. Seattle grew from 3,500 residents in 1880 to over 40,000 by 1890. Tacoma, Spokane, and other cities experienced similar growth. Real estate speculation reached frenzied levels, with fortunes made and lost overnight. The lumber industry mechanized and consolidated, with massive operations like the St. Paul and Tacoma Lumber Company becoming among the world's largest. Agriculture diversified, with hops, fruits, and dairy joining wheat as major products. The fishing industry industrialized, with salmon canneries lining the Columbia River and Puget Sound. The push for statehood. By the late 1880s, Washington Territory had the population and economic development to justify statehood. The territorial system, with its federally appointed governors and limited self-government, increasingly chafed. A constitutional convention met in Olympia in 1889, drafting a progressive constitution that included provisions for women's suffrage, though this was removed before ratification. On November 11, 1889, President Benjamin Harrison signed the proclamation admitting Washington as the 42nd state. The same day, Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota also achieved statehood, reflecting the rapid development of the American West. Part 5. The Progressive Era and Early Statehood, 1889-1920. The Great Seattle Fire and Urban Rebuilding. Just months before statehood, on June 6, 1889, Seattle's commercial district was destroyed by fire. The disaster, caused by an overturned glue pot, consumed 29 city blocks. Rather than devastating the city, the fire catalyzed modernization. Seattle rebuilt with brick and stone, raised streets to improve drainage, and installed modern utilities. The Phoenix-like recovery became part of Seattle's mythology of resilience and ambition. The Klondike Gold Rush. In July 1897, the steamship Portland arrived in Seattle carrying a ton of gold from the Klondike, triggering the last great gold rush. Seattle's merchants, led by Erastus Brainerd, brilliantly marketed their city as the gateway to Alaska. The campaign succeeded spectacularly. Seattle captured most of the rush's commerce, outmaneuvering rival cities. The Klondike trade transformed Seattle from a regional center to a city of national importance. Outfitters, shipyards, and banks prospered. The population doubled between 1900 and 1910. The gold rush established trade connections with Alaska that remain vital today and funded infrastructure that supported further growth. The age of reform, Washington emerged as a center of progressive era reform. The state adopted initiative, referendum, and recall in 1912, giving citizens direct democracy tools. Women won the right to vote in 1910, a decade before the 19th Amendment. The state also pioneered workers' compensation, the 8-hour workday for women, and child labor restrictions. This progressive spirit had radical edges. The industrial workers of the world, IW or Wobblies, found strong support among loggers, miners, and maritime workers. The Everett Massacre of 1916, where vigilantes fired on a boat carrying IW members, killing at least 5, highlighted violent labor tensions. The timber industry's golden age. The early 20th century was the golden age of Washington's timber industry. The state became the nation's leading lumber producer, with massive operations harvesting seemingly inexhaustible forests. Company towns like Snoqualmie, Longview, and Aberdeen emerged. The industry employed tens of thousands and generated enormous wealth, though often at tremendous environmental and human cost. Frederick Weyerhaeuser's 1900 purchase of 900,000 acres from the Northern Pacific created the world's largest timber company. The Lumber Trust consolidated control over vast forests, fundamentally shaping the state's economy and environment for generations. Infrastructure and innovation. The Progressive Era brought remarkable infrastructure development. The Lake Washington Ship Canal, completed in 1917, connected Puget Sound to freshwater lakes, transforming Seattle's geography. The Hiram M. Chittenden locks became an engineering marvel, allowing boats to traverse different water levels. Eastern Washington transformed through irrigation. The Yakima Project and other federal reclamation efforts converted desert into productive farmland. The idea of damming the Columbia River for irrigation and power began gaining support, foreshadowing the massive projects to come. World War I and its aftermath. World War I brought boom times to Washington. Shipyards expanded dramatically. Seattle alone launched 26% of America's wartime ship tonnage. Boeing, founded in 1916, received its first military contracts. Fort Lewis was established as a major training center. The Spruce Production Division mobilized the timber industry for airplane construction. The war's end brought severe disruption. Shipyard employment collapsed, and returning veterans faced unemployment. These tensions exploded in the Seattle General Strike of 1919, when 65,000 workers walked off their jobs in America's first general strike. Though peaceful, the 5-day strike terrified authorities and was blamed on radical agitation, contributing to the Red Scare. Part 6. Between the Wars, 1920-1941. The Roaring Twenties in the Northwest. The 1920s brought mixed fortunes to Washington. Seattle and Spokane prospered as regional commercial centers. The automobile age began transforming society. By 1929, Washington had one car for every 4 residents. Tourism emerged as ferries connected Puget Sound islands and roads penetrated the Cascades. Prohibition, enacted by Washington voters in 1914, before national prohibition, created a thriving bootlegging industry. The Canadian border became a smuggler's paradise, with rum runners using fast boats to evade Coast Guard patrols in the San Juan Islands. Roy Olmsted, Seattle's gentleman bootlegger, ran a sophisticated operation that included radio broadcasts with coded messages. The Great Depression strikes. The 1929 stock market crash devastated Washington. Lumber demand collapsed, mills closed, and unemployment soared above 25%. Seattle's Hooverville, built on the tidal flats south of downtown, became one of the nation's largest homeless encampments, housing over 1,000 men at its peak. Eastern Washington farmers faced catastrophe as wheat prices plummeted and drought struck. The Dust Bowl didn't hit Washington directly, but collapsing agricultural prices forced thousands off their lands. Banks failed across the state. Only federal intervention prevented complete financial collapse. The New Deal transforms. Washington Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal had perhaps greater impact on Washington than any other state. The Civilian Conservation Corps employed thousands in forest and park development. The Works Progress Administration built schools, roads, and public buildings that still serve communities today. Most significantly, the Public Works Administration funded Grand Coulee Dam. Authorized in 1933, this massive project on the Columbia River promised cheap electricity and irrigation for 500,000 acres. The dam became the world's largest concrete structure and a symbol of New Deal ambition. The Bonneville Dam, completed in 1937, initiated the transformation of the Columbia into a river of power. These projects laid groundwork for Washington's industrial future, while forever altering the river's ecology and indigenous fishing sites. Labor struggles and political radicalism. The Depression radicalized Washington politics. The Washington Commonwealth Federation, advocating production for use rather than profit, nearly captured the Democratic Party. In 1936, Seattle elected labor leader Dave Beck to the city council, beginning his rise to national labor prominence. The Longshore Strike of 1934 shut down West Coast ports and led to violent confrontations. Despite setbacks, organized labor emerged stronger, with union membership soaring. The Congress of Industrial Organizations successfully organized Boeing workers, lumber workers, and others previously outside union ranks. Cultural developments. Despite economic hardship, the 1930s saw significant cultural development. The University of Washington expanded its research capacity. The Seattle Art Museum opened in 1933. The Federal Writers Project documented state history and folklore, preserving stories that might otherwise have been lost. Mark Tobey and other artists developed the Northwest School, an artistic movement emphasizing Asian influences and mystical themes. This period established Seattle's reputation as a cultural center independent of East Coast influence. Part 7. World War II and Transformation, 1941-1945. Pearl Harbor and immediate mobilization. The December 7th, 1941, attack on Pearl Harbor thrust Washington into war. The state's strategic Pacific location made it vital to the war effort. Military bases expanded rapidly, blackouts were instituted, and civil defense organizations mobilized. Fear of Japanese invasion led to the fortification of coastal areas and constant military patrols. The Boeing boom Boeing's transformation during World War II reshaped Washington's economy permanently. Employment exploded from 4,000 workers in 1940 to over 45,000 by 1944. The company produced nearly 7,000 B-17 Flying Fortresses and over 1,000 B-29 Superfortresses, including the Enola Gay and Boxcar that dropped atomic bombs on Japan. To hide factories from potential bombing, Boeing built an entire fake neighborhood atop Plant 2, complete with fake houses and streets. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers as Rosie the Riveters, fundamentally changing gender dynamics in the workplace. Shipbuilding and war production. Puget Sound's shipyards worked around the clock. The Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver produced escort carriers and Liberty ships at remarkable speed. One ship was completed in just 10 days. Bremerton Naval Shipyard repaired battle-damaged vessels and built new warships. By war's end, Washington yards had produced hundreds of vessels. The aluminum industry, powered by cheap Columbia River electricity, expanded enormously. The Alcoa plant in Vancouver and Reynolds facility in Longview produced critical materials for aircraft production. The Hanford site's role remained secret, but its demand for power drove further electrical development. The Manhattan Project and Hanford in 1943, the federal government secretly acquired 600 square miles of land in south central Washington for the Manhattan Project. The Hanford site, chosen for its isolation and Columbia River water, became home to the world's first plutonium production reactors. The B reactor, built in just 11 months, produced plutonium for the Trinity test and Nagasaki bomb. Over 50,000 workers lived in the instant city of Richland, most unaware of their project's purpose. The environmental and health consequences of plutonium production would only become apparent decades later, leaving a complex legacy of scientific achievement and environmental contamination. Japanese American incarceration. One of Washington's most shameful chapters occurred with Executive Order 9066, forcing the incarceration of Japanese Americans. Over 13,000 Washington residents of Japanese descent, two-thirds of them American citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes and imprisoned in camps. The Puyallup Fairgrounds became Camp Harmony, a temporary detention center where families lived in converted animal stalls. Most were then sent to Minidoka Camp in Idaho. Japanese Americans lost homes, businesses, and farms worth millions. The trauma and injustice of incarceration left lasting wounds, though many Japanese Americans still served heroically in the military, including the decorated 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Home front changes. The war transformed Washington society. Seattle's population grew by 100,000. Women and minorities gained industrial employment previously denied them. African American population in Seattle increased from 3,789 in 1940 to over 15,000 by 1950, though they faced severe housing discrimination and were excluded from many neighborhoods. Rationing, war bonds, and victory gardens became part of daily life. The state exceeded every war bond quota. Communities organized scrap drives and civil defense drills. The shared sacrifice created social solidarity, but also revealed deep inequalities that would fuel post-war civil rights movements. Part 8. The Post-War Boom Era, 1945, 1970, Economic Transformation, and the Jet Age. The post-war era brought unprecedented prosperity to Washington. Boeing successfully transitioned from military to commercial aircraft production. The 707, introduced in 1958, launched the Jet Age and made Boeing the world's leading aircraft manufacturer. The company became Washington's economic engine, directly employing over 100,000 by the 1960s. The Columbia River dams, continued after the war, made Washington a center of aluminum production and cheap electricity. The Grand Coulee Dam's irrigation transformed the Columbia Basin into one of America's most productive agricultural regions, though at enormous cost to salmon runs and indigenous cultures. Suburbanization and interstate highways. Like the rest of America, Washington experienced massive suburbanization. Bellevue transformed from strawberry farms to Seattle's largest suburb. The Northgate Mall, opened in 1950, pioneered the suburban shopping center concept. Federal Housing Administration loans enabled homeownership for many, though discriminatory practices excluded minorities from suburban opportunities. The interstate highway system reshaped Washington's geography. I-5, completed through Seattle in 1967, demolished neighborhoods but connected the region. I-90's completion across Snoqualmie Pass improved east-west connections. These highways accelerated suburban sprawl while devastating urban communities, particularly communities of color. The space race and high technology. The space race brought federal investment and high technology industry to Washington. Boeing won major NASA contracts, including the first stage of the Saturn V rocket that sent astronauts to the moon. The University of Washington expanded research programs, becoming a major research institution. The seeds of the future tech industry were planted. The University of Washington's computer science program, established in 1967, began training the engineers who would transform the region. Small technology companies emerged around Boeing and the university, creating an ecosystem that would later produce Microsoft and Amazon. Environmental awakening. The post-war boom's environmental costs became increasingly apparent. Salmon runs collapsed due to dams and overfishing. Puget Sound showed signs of pollution, clear-cutting scarred mountainsides. Lake Washington became so polluted that swimming was banned. Washington became a center of environmental activism. The North Cascades National Park was established in 1968 after years of advocacy. The metro system cleaned up Lake Washington through innovative sewage treatment. Senator Henry Scoop Jackson championed environmental legislation, including the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. Social change and civil rights. The civil rights movement challenged Washington's racial inequalities. Though lacking the South's legal segregation, Washington had pervasive discrimination in housing, employment, and education. Seattle's schools were de facto segregated through housing patterns and district boundaries. The Black Panther Party established a Seattle chapter in 1968, running breakfast programs and health clinics. Native American activists occupied Fort Lawton in 1970, successfully demanding it become a cultural center. The Chicano movement organized farm workers and challenged discrimination. These movements forced recognition of Washington's diversity and demanded equal rights. The Century 21 Exposition. The 1962 Seattle World's Fair, the Century 21 Exposition, symbolized Washington's optimism and modernization. The Space Needle became an instant icon. The fair attracted 10 million visitors and left lasting infrastructure, including the Seattle Center, Pacific Science Center, and monorail. The fair projected Seattle as a city of the future, emphasizing science, space, and Pacific Rim connections. Elvis Presley filmed It Happened at the World's Fair there. The event marked Seattle's emergence from provincial city to cosmopolitan center and boosted civic confidence for decades. Part 9, Crisis and Reinvention, 1970-1990. The Boeing Bust. The 1970s began with economic catastrophe. Boeing, having bet everything on the 747, faced canceled orders and massive layoffs. Employment dropped from 101,000 in 1970 to 38,000 by 1971. The Boeing bust devastated the regional economy. Unemployment reached 13%, highest in the nation. The famous billboard, "Will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights captured the desperation. Housing prices collapsed. Businesses failed. The crisis forced recognition that economic dependence on a single company was dangerous, spurring efforts at economic diversification. Environmental battles. The 1970s brought fierce environmental battles. The proposed Northern Tier pipeline, which would have brought Alaskan oil across Washington, was defeated after massive opposition. The Washington Environmental Policy Act, modeled on federal legislation, required environmental review for major projects. The Bolt decision of 1974 revolutionized fishing rights, affirming that treaties guaranteed indigenous peoples 50% of harvestable salmon. The decision sparked violent protests from non-native fishermen, but ultimately forced recognition of treaty rights and collaborative resource management. Mount St. Helens erupts. On May 18, 1980, Mount St. Helens exploded in the deadliest volcanic eruption in U.S. history. The blast killed 57 people, destroyed 200 square miles of forest, and sent ash around the world. The eruption caused over $1 billion in damage and transformed the landscape. The disaster also demonstrated nature's power to regenerate. The Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument became a living laboratory for ecological recovery. The eruption reminded Washingtonians that they lived in a geologically active region where dramatic change could come suddenly. The rise of Microsoft. In 1979, a small company called Microsoft moved from Albuquerque to Bellevue. Founded by Bill Gates and Paul Allen, two Seattle natives, the company would transform Washington's economy. Microsoft's MS-DOS became the standard operating system for IBM PCs, launching the personal computer revolution. By 1986, Microsoft's initial public offering created hundreds of millionaires. The company's success attracted other technology firms and venture capital. The Microsoft millionaires invested in other startups, real estate, and philanthropy, fundamentally changing the region's wealth distribution. Economic diversification. The Boeing bust forced economic diversification. Tourism expanded with marketing of Washington's natural beauty. The wine industry emerged as Columbia Valley's potential was recognized. Starbucks, founded in 1971, began its transformation from local coffee roaster to global phenomenon. Trade with Asia expanded dramatically. The Port of Seattle modernized to handle container ships. Washington agricultural products found Asian markets. Japanese and Korean companies established American operations in Washington. The state began its pivot toward the Pacific Rim economy. Cultural Renaissance. Despite economic challenges, the 1970s and 1980s saw cultural flowering. The grunge music scene emerged in Seattle's underground clubs. Bands like Heart and Jimi Hendrix posthumously gained international recognition. The Seattle International Film Festival, founded in 1976, became one of America's largest. Bruce Lee, though dying young in 1973, left a lasting impact on Seattle's culture and martial arts community. The Wing Luke Museum, established in 1967, grew to become the nation's largest Asian Pacific American museum. Native American artists gained recognition, with traditional and contemporary works exhibited internationally. Part 10. The Technology Revolution, 1990-2010. The dot-com boom. The 1990s brought unprecedented prosperity driven by technology. Microsoft Windows dominated personal computing. Hundreds of technology startups emerged. Seattle became Silicon Valley North, with companies like Real Networks, Amazon, founded in 1994, and Expedia. Venture capital poured into the region. Amazon, started by Jeff Bezos in a Bellevue garage, epitomized the era's ambition. Beginning as an online bookstore, it survived the dot-com crash to become one of the world's most valuable companies. The company's growth transformed Seattle's South Lake Union from an industrial area to a gleaming tech campus. Starbucks and the coffee revolution. Starbucks, under Howard Schultz's leadership, transformed from a local chain to a global phenomenon. The company went public in 1992 with 165 stores. By 2000, it had over 3,500 worldwide. Starbucks changed global coffee culture while making Seattle synonymous with coffee. The success spawned countless independent coffee shops and roasters. Seattle's coffee culture became part of its identity, influencing everything from office culture to social life. The third place concept, neither home nor work, became central to urban planning discussions. The WTO protests and globalization debates, the 1999 World Trade Organization meetings in Seattle triggered massive protests that shocked the world. The battle in Seattle saw 40,000 protesters challenge corporate globalization. Police used tear gas and rubber bullets. The National Guard was deployed. The protests forced cancellation of opening ceremonies and influenced global discussions about trade and inequality. The protests reflected growing concerns about globalization's impacts. While technology companies prospered, traditional industries struggled. Income inequality increased dramatically. Housing costs soared, displacing longtime residents. The protests presaged the Occupy movement and continuing debates about capitalism and inequality. The dot-com bust and recovery. The 2001 dot-com crash hit Washington hard. Hundreds of startups failed. Microsoft stock lost half its value. Amazon nearly went bankrupt, its stock falling from $107 to $7. Unemployment spiked. The September 11th attacks further damaged Boeing's aircraft business. However, the strongest companies emerged stronger. Amazon expanded beyond books. Microsoft, despite antitrust challenges, maintained dominance. Boeing recovered with the 787 Dreamliner program. The crash cleared out weak companies and speculation, setting the stage for sustainable growth. Biotech and medical research. The 2000s saw Washington emerge as a biotechnology center. The Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center pioneered bone marrow transplantation and cancer vaccines. The Institute for Systems Biology advanced personalized medicine. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, established in 2000, became the world's largest private foundation, focusing on global health. Paul Allen's investments in brain science, including the Allen Institute for Brain Science, made Seattle a neuroscience hub. The University of Washington Medical School became one of America's top research institutions. These developments diversified the economy beyond software and aerospace. Cultural evolution. The early 2000s brought significant cultural change. Marriage equality gained support, with Washington voters approving same-sex marriage in 2012. The region's racial diversity increased dramatically, with immigrants from Asia, Africa, and Latin America transforming suburban cities like Bellevue and Kent. Seattle's music scene evolved beyond grunge. Hip-hop artists like Sir Mix-a-Lot and Macklemore gained national attention. The city developed a thriving arts scene with expanded museums, theaters, and galleries. Pike Place Market was renovated while maintaining its authentic character. Housing crisis and urban growth. The tech boom created a severe housing affordability crisis. Seattle home prices doubled between 2000 and 2007. The 2008 financial crisis briefly cooled the market, but prices quickly resumed climbing. Homelessness increased dramatically despite the region's wealth. Urban growth management attempts had mixed results. The Growth Management Act concentrated development in cities, but also contributed to housing costs. Light rail finally opened in 2009, decades after other cities. The tension between growth and livability became the defining political issue. Part 11, The Modern Era, 2010, present. The second tech boom. The 2010s brought another technology boom exceeding the 1990s. Amazon's growth accelerated exponentially, employment growing from 33,700 in 2010 to over 750,000 by 2020. The company transformed from online retailer to cloud computing giant with Amazon Web Services, while also revolutionizing logistics and entertainment. Microsoft successfully reinvented itself under CEO Satya Nadella, focusing on cloud computing and abandoning failed mobile efforts. The company's market value exceeded $1 trillion. Other tech giants established major operations. Google, Facebook, Apple, and Chinese companies all expanded in the region. The sharing economy and startup culture. New companies emerged challenging traditional industries. Expedia became a travel giant. Zillow transformed real estate. T-Mobile, through aggressive innovation, challenged larger carriers. The region developed a mature startup ecosystem with accelerators, venture capital, and experienced entrepreneurs. The sharing economy brought disruption and controversy. Uber and Lyft challenged taxi regulations. Airbnb affected housing availability. These companies offered convenience, but also raised questions about worker rights and community impacts. Climate change and environmental challenges. Climate change impacts became undeniable. Wildfire smoke made Seattle's air quality worse than Beijing's. Ocean acidification threatened shellfish industries. Glaciers retreated dramatically. Heat waves shattered records, with Seattle reaching 108-degree Fahrenheit in 2021. Washington positioned itself as a climate leader. The state committed to carbon neutrality by 2050. Renewable energy expanded dramatically. Electric vehicle adoption accelerated. However, tensions remained between environmental goals and economic growth, particularly regarding aviation and shipping emissions. Social justice movements. The 2010s saw renewed social justice activism. Black Lives Matter protests following police killings brought thousands to streets. The Seattle Police Department entered a federal consent decree addressing excessive force. The Capitol Hill organized protest on CHOP in 2020 gained international attention. Indigenous rights movements achieved significant victories. The Elwha River Dam removal, completed in 2014, was the largest dam removal project in history. The renaming of landmarks to honor indigenous heritage gained momentum. Seattle's Indigenous Peoples Day replaced Columbus Day. The COVID-19 pandemic. Washington became the first U.S. COVID-19 epicenter in early 2020. The Life Care Center outbreak in Kirkland killed dozens. Governor Jay Inslee issued the nation's first stay-at-home order. The pandemic devastated hospitality and retail while accelerating remote work adoption. The tech industry thrived as remote work became standard. Amazon and Microsoft stocks soared. Housing prices increased as people sought larger homes. However, downtown Seattle emptied as workers stayed home, challenging urban vitality. Small businesses struggled despite government assistance. Political polarization and urban-rural divide. Washington's political divisions deepened. The Puget Sound region became increasingly progressive, while eastern Washington remained conservative. Seattle elected socialist Kshama Sawant to city council. The state legislature passed progressive taxation, gun control, and climate legislation. The urban-rural divide manifested in debates over everything from COVID restrictions to police funding. Some eastern Washington counties discussed joining Idaho. The tension between Seattle's prosperity and rural economic struggles created resentment and political conflict. Economic transformation continues. By 2020, Washington's economy had fundamentally transformed. Tech employment exceeded aerospace. The state became a center for clean energy with massive wind farms and solar installations. The cannabis industry, legalized in 2012, generated billions in revenue. However, prosperity wasn't shared equally. Income inequality reached record levels. The homelessness crisis worsened despite massive spending. Middle-class families were priced out of cities. The question of how to maintain economic dynamism while ensuring broad prosperity remained unresolved. Part 12. Washington Today and Tomorrow. Contemporary Challenges. As Washington moves through the 2020s, it faces complex challenges. The housing affordability crisis continues with no easy solutions. Homelessness remains visible and politically contentious. Infrastructure struggles to keep pace with growth. The Cascadia subduction zone. Earthquake threat looms. Scientists warn of a potential magnitude 9.0 earthquake that could devastate the region. Mental health and addiction crises strain social services. The fentanyl epidemic has caused deaths to skyrocket. Climate refugees from California and other states increase migration pressure. Water rights become increasingly contentious as snowpack decreases and demand grows. Economic strengths and vulnerabilities. Washington's economy remains robust but vulnerable. The state hosts 13 Fortune 500 companies. Per capita income ranks among America's highest. The Port of Seattle and Port of Tacoma, now allied, form the fourth largest container gateway in the United States. Yet, dependence on tech giants creates risk. Antitrust actions against Amazon and Microsoft could impact employment. Boeing's struggles with the 737 MAX and production quality raise concerns. Trade tensions with China affect exports. The state's tax system, dependent on sales tax without income tax, creates volatility and regressivity. Cultural vitality and identity. Modern Washington blends tradition and innovation. Seattle's Pike Place market remains authentic while the city transforms around it. Native American tribes operate successful casinos and cultural centers while fighting for sovereignty. The state's craft beer, wine, and culinary scenes gain international recognition. The region's natural beauty remains its defining characteristic. Mount Rainier still dominates the horizon. The San Juan Islands offer escape from urban stress. Olympic National Park preserves ancient forests. These landscapes shape regional identity and attract millions of visitors annually. Looking forward, opportunities and uncertainties, Washington stands at another transformation point. Artificial intelligence development accelerates with major research centers. Clean technology companies proliferate. Space industry grows with Blue Origin and other companies. Biotechnology promises medical breakthroughs. Yet uncertainties abound. Will tech giants maintain dominance or face disruption? Can the region solve housing affordability? Will climate change make the region more or less attractive? How will automation affect employment? Can urban and rural Washington find common ground? The continuing story, Washington's story, continues evolving. from indigenous peoples managing resources sustainably for millennia, to pioneers seeking new opportunities, to modern innovators changing how the world works. Common themes emerge: adaptation, innovation, and tension between preservation and progress. The state that gave the world Boeing airplanes and Microsoft Windows, Starbucks coffee and Amazon delivery, grunge music and marriage equality, continues pushing boundaries. Its residents debate growth versus livability, prosperity versus equality, innovation versus tradition. Conclusion: the Evergreen State's enduring legacy. As we conclude this journey through Washington's history, we see a state shaped by dramatic geography and equally dramatic human ambition. From the Columbia River to Puget Sound, from the Palouse to the Pacific, Washington has been a land of possibility and challenge, boom and bust, conflict and cooperation. The indigenous peoples who first called this land home understood something essential: that prosperity comes from working with nature rather than against it. Though colonization nearly destroyed their cultures, their persistence and resurgence remind us that Washington's story didn't begin with European arrival and won't end with current residents. Washington's history teaches that transformative change can come suddenly, whether from volcanic eruption, economic collapse, or technological revolution. The state has repeatedly reinvented itself, from fur trade outpost to timber kingdom, from aerospace center to technology hub. This adaptability may be Washington's greatest strength. The tensions that define Washington, urban versus rural, growth versus preservation, innovation versus equity, aren't bugs but features. These debates force continual re examination of values and priorities. The state's progressive tradition of citizen initiative and environmental protection coexists with entrepreneurial capitalism and military industry. Today's Washington would astonish its founders. Seattle's skyline pierces clouds that once reflected only forest. The Columbia River, once wild and salmon rich, is now a chain of reservoirs powering the digital age. Eastern Washington's desert blooms with irrigated agriculture. The population exceeds 7.7 million, more than the entire American West when Washington became a state. Yet continuities remain. The mountains still gather storms from the Pacific. Salmon still fight upstream to spawn, though in diminished numbers. The entrepreneurial spirit that built sawmills and shipyards now builds software and spacecraft. The natural beauty that drew settlers still attracts newcomers seeking quality of life alongside economic opportunity. Washington's next chapter remains unwritten. Will it lead America's response to climate change? Can it demonstrate that prosperity and sustainability aren't mutually exclusive? Will it bridge divides between communities and cultures? The answers will shape not just Washington, but provide models for others facing similar challenges. The Evergreen State earned its nickname from forests that stay green year round, but it equally describes a state that continually renews itself, adapting to new challenges while maintaining core strengths, from Native American longhouses to Space Needle, from pioneer cabins to Amazon spheres, from salmon runs to server farms. Washington's story is one of perpetual transformation rooted in enduring landscape. As Washington faces its future, it carries forward lessons from its past: respect for nature's power, confidence in human ingenuity, recognition that diversity strengthens communities, and understanding that today's innovations become tomorrow's traditions. the state that connects America to the Pacific, that bridges east and west, that balances wilderness and metropolis, continues evolving while remaining essentially itself, forever green, forever growing, forever at the frontier of what's possible. This is Washington State, a place where ancient forests meet cutting edge technology, where snow capped peaks overlook bustling ports, where history isn't just remembered, but actively made every day. The story continues, and its next chapters promise to be as dramatic and transformative as those that came before.